Catus Maximus here. This time we're reviewing the GM PowerTorque 12-point universal 3/8 inch chrome socket set. We have both the metric and the imperial, and I got these because it's actually kind of hard to find these universal sockets that are in 12-point. And surprisingly enough, when you're in a situation where you really need to use a universal socket like this, it's usually a pretty tight spot that you just can't use a normal ratchet and straight socket with. And the issue I've had is all universal sockets tend to be a little bit loose with the joints, and that's so they can operate pretty easily. So they're always kind of tough to get the hold in the position if you have to try to reach and get the socket onto the fastener. 12-point makes that much easier than 6-point, and so it makes the universal sockets quite a bit more useful. These were reasonably priced. I believe it was like 20 bucks for the Imperial and like 30 bucks for the metric set. The metric set actually goes from 10 through 19 millimeters in a 10-piece set, so there are no skips. You don't get the smallest or the largest sizes, but that's really nice coverage. Another thing I like about them is that they stamp the size onto the socket twice. And I thought that's actually a pretty good idea and forward thinking. So there and then down here. They seem to be pretty well made. They don't use a screw. They use like a pin and then they swage it or they press in the middle to flare it out. And as far as their look and finish, they're pretty good. You can see that they flute the drive side and they have proper cutout for the indents. And on the socket, it actually looks just fine. I'm sure these aren't, as good as a snap-on or something along those lines. But they're still pretty darn nice. They have a traditional long tang here, so usually when these sockets fail, it's either the pin breaks or this little tang shears off. You always have to be aware of that because they're not designed for the highest torques. You try to avoid actually breaking the fastener. If you can get a wrench or something to at least initially break the fastener, rather than using the universal socket itself, you'll find that they do last a lot longer. But they're, of course, notorious for failing just because of the how thin they have to be down here. Because of these long tangs, if you get into a real tight spot, these will want to jam up, and that sometimes can be frustrating. So you have to be careful to not get too steep of an angle so they don't jam up. Let's go and compare these to a couple other universal sockets. We'll do the 12 millimeter, and I happen to actually have one snap-on. I found this in a random tool bin, so I have one snap-on 12 millimeter. We have the Craftsman USA, and then of course the GM PowerTorque 12-point. Let's line them up like this. First, we'll compare how tall they are. And this is a good example, is that the GM PowerTorque, being a little bit cheaper, they don't pay, and I'm not sure why they do. Cheaper tools do this, but they tend to be a little bit longer, maybe because they make a lot of other tools that have, this little billet that's cut off to that size, so it makes it cheaper. So the GM PowerTorque is not as compact as the Snap-on. Surprisingly enough, the Snap-on is not as compact as the Craftsman, so that kind of surprised me. As far as overall fit and finish, they all are pretty similar. I mean, as far as how the socket looks, it's great, and the drive ends are great as compared to these other sockets. One thing I did want to mention versus the PowerTorque or the Snap-on is that the Craftsman does this wide V here. So that gives you two advantages. One, it's not as thin as it is on these, so it's less likely to actually fail at the eyelet. And this wide V here is something that you want to watch, or is an advantage because it prevents it from going at such a steep angle, and then these Craftsmans won't actually jam up on you because that angle prevents them from getting so far over that they lock up. And so that's one issue you'll run into with these PowerTorques and most other universal sockets. So anyway, that's it for this review, but I really appreciate you watching, and more reviews to come. Please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.